And you are all set.
Okay, good evening. I call the meeting to order. It's good to see everybody. This is our second meeting for the Mayoral Ad Hoc Committee for Diversity and Equality. And equity. We're going to start with introductions. And I guess I'm Aisha Hall, the chair, co-chair with the mayor who will be joining us shortly. And I'll pass that to Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andy Naramo.
And he's gonna pass it to Brian O'Malley.
I am the police chief here in Lewiston, Brian O'Malley.
Adjourn. Can't hear you.
Elgin Physic.
I'm still having a hard time hearing you. Is that just me?
Hear me now?
Yes.
My name's Elgin Physic.
Marcella, introduce yourself.
I'm Marcella Paris. I'm the library director with the City of Lewiston.
And Tanya.
Tanya Bailey Curry, community member and therapist at Bates College.
Noel.
Noel Chaddick. I'm the Vice President of Equity and Inclusion at Bates College, and I have been in Lewiston for just about a year.
Laura. I'm just going in my order.
I'm Laura Ligori. I'm the executive director of MindBridge and helping to lead the city spirit process.
And we'll go to Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Gelinas. I am city councilor for Ward 7.
Dane.
How you doing? Dane Morgan here. Local everything in Lewiston. Enjoy it, love it. I love to be here. Thank you.
Hawa.
Hi, I'm Hawa Abdel, Lewiston Public Schools.
James.
Hello, I'm James Ford, Family and Community Support Coordinator for Lewiston Public Schools.
Luke.
Luke Jensen, City Councilor, Ward 5.
And we have Dale and Dennis. Are we going to introduce you all?
Sure. I'm Dennis Dote. I'm the city administrator.
I'm Dale Dowdy. I'm the deputy city administrator.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, look, and it's Mark.
Thank you. That was an introduction, I take it.
Oh, no, I mean, obviously. Mark Kayer, my co-chair. And I think that would be everybody. Is that right? Dennis, thank you. And right on time introductions. All right, we'll move on because I know we have a lot to cover. And we'll get right into Chief O'Malley's presentation.
You're on mute, Chief.
Oh, sorry.
All right, so I just have to hit share screen. I'm assuming that's what I do. Ooh.
Yes, sir. But is he a host?
You should have a green little button that says share screen, Chief. If not, hold on. Just made you a co-host. You should be able to have the controls to do that. You have a little share screen on the bottom.
Yep, now I do.
There you go. You got to select. There you go.
Yep. All right, so it's my understanding that the city has set up a, was it OneNote, Dennis?
Yeah, why don't I just touch that really quickly? We have established a OneNote account. During this meeting, you all will receive a link from Dale Dowdy for that. We are working through some minor technical difficulties. There's all read-only at this point, so you can't add to the files. We're just working through that. Unfortunately, we discovered that issue after our IT folks went home. So we are, we'll figure that out, just exactly what we got to do in settings-wise. But in terms of all the documents and all the policies, everything the chief is going to be talking about tonight is all going to be, you'll be able to access that through that link that you'll receive in your email.
Thank you.
And I also got a request for a lot of information, so I'm going to try to download that. And when I get that, what I'll do is I'll send it to the OneNote, and it might be easier if I just can send out an email to say I'll put something new in there so folks can review that. I believe yesterday I tried sending out stuff and it took me quite a while. So I think anybody that would be for James and how anybody that had a school department, City of Lewiston School Department, I kept getting kicked back. So I think some of you may have probably gotten about 12 emails from me just trying to send this out. So I think the OneNote will be much easier, and I'll try to put stuff in a lot sooner than the night before when we have one of these meetings. So what I'd like to do first is go over our response to resistance policy. And how do, okay. And this is reviewed here at the police department, our response to resistance policy. We have, I want to say it's close to over 480 policies here at the Lewiston Police Department, rules and regulations and standards that the officers have to follow. So the purpose of this standard operating procedure is to establish guidelines governing the use of physical force, its limitations, and to clearly delineate prohibited activities. I've taken, I mean, the policy that I sent you was 28 pages, and then it had several other policies. So I don't have everything in this PowerPoint. I've tried to take some of the highlights out of that. And then if there's any questions after I've gone through this, I'll be more than happy to try to answer them for you. And then once again, this is the policy here at the Lewiston Police Department, that physical force be only used to affect the lawful objectives, and then only when and to the extent, both in terms of the amount and degree and duration that its use is necessary. It is also policy that officers use de-escalation tactics and training in efforts to limit the use of force. In all instances, the use of force shall be immediately terminated upon the cessation of resistance. And this is our de-escalation directive. And it talks about the tactics and techniques that officers should use to avoid physical confrontations unless immediately necessary to protect someone or to stop dangerous behavior while minimizing the need to use force during an incident when the totality of the circumstances and time permit. De-escalation tactics and techniques are employed to increase the likelihood of voluntary compliance and cooperation. It is the policy of this department that when all unreasonable known circumstances indicated it is safe, prudent, and feasible to do so, an officer shall attempt to slow down, reduce the intensity, or stabilize the situation so that more time, options, or resources may become available for incident resolution. And I think some of you are familiar with the crisis intervention training. That's part of that de-escalation. I'll talk about when we go over the training segment of this, but we also have verbal judo is another way of the officers using their verbal skills to de-escalate a situation. This continues to talk about the de-escalation. You want to decrease the exposure to the potential threat by using distance or physical barriers between an uncooperative subject and officer. We don't want the officers to place themselves in danger or in a situation where they'll have to use force, as opposed to, say, if they stood behind a car, just created some distance so they could talk somebody down from the situation. And we talked about maximizing the use of cover or concealment to reduce officers' exposure to potential threats and place the officer in a safer position. Communicating from a safe position to gain the subject's compliance through the use of verbal persuasion or warnings. Communication techniques should engage active listening to calm agitated individuals and promote rational decision-making. Also, the officers are taught about, you're reading body language, but that also goes for the person you're dealing with reading your body language. So they talked about exhibiting a relaxed body language. If they have to use force, the use of level of force must reflect the totality of the reasonable circumstances surrounding the immediate situation. We don't want officers overreacting, using more force than necessary. Officers may either escalate or de-escalate the use of force as the situation progresses or as circumstances change. And circumstances will change very rapidly when you're dealing with somebody who's agitated and or has mental health or substance use issues. And this is why we'd rather have our officers do the de-escalation than just run right in the first 30 seconds and, you know, resort to physical means. Again, an officer has a duty to intervene at the earliest safe opportunity to prevent or stop the use of unreasonable force by another officer. The incident must be immediately reported to a supervisor if this situation does occur. And a lot of people, we call it response to resistance here at the Lewiston Police Department, but I think the common term most folks are familiar with is use of force. There's also, it used to be called the force continuum, but it's been renamed. It's called the situational use of force. And this is a dynamic process by which an officer assesses, plans, and responds to situations that threaten public and officer safety. The assessment process begins with the situation immediately confronting the officer and moves to the suspect's behavior and the officer's perceptions and tactical considerations. Based on this assessment, the officer selects from the available response options while continuing to evaluate the evolving situation and adapt a plan and actions that are reasonable and effective for the particular situation. So what that means is we teach officers, it's called MARC training, which stands for Mechanics of Arrest and Restraint and Control. And they have all different options of what they can do depending on the situation that they're faced with. So we'll talk about verbal direction, and this is the majority of situations can be resolved by good communication, skills of verbal direction. Often the mere presence of an officer and proper verbal direction will be suffice to persuade most individuals to follow an officer's direction. In any verbal confrontation, fear and anger must be diffused before a person will be able to understand the officer's commands. That's where we talk about the de-escalation. And this will require good communication skills and patience. Successful communication skills techniques can prevent many physical confrontations from escalating to higher levels. A lot of that does go back to our training, but also when I look to hire people, I'm not looking for the biggest or the strongest guy. I'm looking for officers or individuals who have people skills, who can talk to someone. You can weigh 125 pounds and still be effective. You don't need to be a big, brutish individual to be a police officer. So I really rely on people who have people skills more than just the physical skills. Now, a lot of our policy is based on Maine state law, and that's when you see anything that says 17A, that's in the section, this one is 755. That's the title and section of Maine state law that allows officers to use different types of force. So the different types of force, some are considered less than lethal force. That's when required to overcome resistance to a lawful arrest or other seizure or detention, a lawful search and or seizure, and to prevent an unlawful escape from custody by an arrested or detained person as defined in, and that's the Maine state law. You can use less than lethal force when required in self-defense, when required in defense of another person against unlawful violence to his or her property, and when required to prevent suicide or self-inflicted injury as defined in Title 34B. And that's placing someone in protective custody. If you have to take someone who's been making suicidal statements or has taken some substantial steps to harm themselves, we can place someone in protective custody. If we have to put them in handcuffs to get them the help we need, this is the law that allows us to do that. And we talk about the considerations that should be weighed prior to using force. It would be the nature of the offense, the behavior of the suspect against whom the use of force is being considered, the demeanor and or the actions of other individuals present, the potential for third-party intervention, the actual physical odds against the officer, the proximity of available backup, the feasibility of an alternative action, and the urgency of the situation. So when we talk about the proximity of available backup, if I have one single officer at a scene, he obviously might have to use more force if this person he's dealing with is larger, stronger, better trained than the officer is. So that's, again, why we try to talk about de-escalation if you can and slow things down, and having additional officers assist you so that you don't have to use a more force than is necessary to take someone into custody. Then deadly force. The officer must make a swift and correct judgment under conditions of extreme physical and emotional stress. The officer must be able to instinctively assess the following conditions without delay: alternative methods of arrest, position of officer's fire or suspect's fire with respect to innocent persons, the ability to safely control fire, that's gunfire we're talking about, absolute target identification, effective gunfire upon unseen persons, and known seriousness of the crime. When an officer is making the decision to utilize a firearm, they must consider whether such use is authorized and justified within proper police procedure. Authorization generally deals with the permissible use of firearms by law enforcement officers that are specified. Again, it's in Maine state law. If feasible, the officer shall give a warning immediately prior to the use of deadly force. And examples are stop or I'll shoot, and if possible, multiple times. But this warning should not begin if the officer believes that would place the officer or others in jeopardy. And then we have different situations when an officer can and then can't use their firearm. An officer may use a firearm in the following circumstances if no other reasonable alternatives is available, and the officer reasonably believes deadly force is necessary to defend himself or herself or a third party from what he or she, this is a big part here, is reasonably believes the imminent use of force. And I was reading something the other day online about out in Minnesota, and they're going to change their law from using deadly force from apparent to imminent threat to officers and others. Here in the state of Maine, and this imminent use of force, this is state law. We already have it as imminent. And I just wanted to point that out, that people are changing in other parts of the country to match what we're already doing here in Maine. Apprehend or prevent the escape of a person who he or she reasonably believes has committed a crime involving the use or threatened use of deadly force, is using a deadly weapon and attempting to escape. Otherwise indicates that she or he is likely to seriously endanger human life or to inflict serious injury unless apprehended without delay, and the officer has made a reasonable effort to advise that person that he or she is a police officer making an arrest, or when the officer reasonably believes that that person to be arrested or otherwise knows that the officer is a law enforcement officer attempting to effect an arrest or prevent an escape from arrest. This again is Maine state law. That is part of our policy. Now we have the section on when you can't use your firearm. When foreseeable that less force can accomplish the purpose without unreasonably endangering the officer or other person. To effect an arrest of a D and E crimes, and these are misdemeanor crimes, not your high end, not your violent felonies or your felonies, except when it is necessary for an officer to protect himself or herself from other persons from death or serious bodily injury, and all other reasonable alternatives have failed. On mere suspicion that an officer or the other person is in imminent danger of deadly force. So mere suspicion is not a reason to use deadly force. Upon any person ordered to halt on mere suspicion or who runs or drives away to avoid arrest for a misdemeanor or a felony not involving deadly force. Flight in and of itself is not necessary evidence of the commission of a crime. It is not sufficient reason for the use of a firearm. Warning shots shall not be used. That hasn't been allowed for I don't know how long, probably 40 plus years. At a suspect who is concealed in a vehicle or structure which appears to be occupied by innocent persons. At or from a moving vehicle. And now there's an exception to this. That is to defend himself or herself or another person when being fired upon. So if an officer is standing on the side of the road and somebody's driving up and shooting at them, they can shoot back. To defend himself or herself or another person when a motor vehicle is being used by an assailant as a dangerous weapon, and there's an imminent threat or death of serious bodily injury, and there exists no other reasonable alternative or avenue of escape. This would be a situation if an officer is outside of his vehicle and someone's about to crash into him, he can't run or she can't run or jump out of the way. And there's no other way to defend themselves that they can, but that's very rare. So really this talks more about somebody driving away in a car. We're not just gonna start firing shots at them as they're driving down Park Street. That's not an allowable use of a firearm. When the occupants of a vehicle being pursued have committed a felony in which deadly force was used and there is probable cause to believe that the occupants are the actual offenders and that their imminent apprehension is necessary for public safety and there's no other reasonable means to prevent their escape and secure their arrest. That would be an occasion when they could use the firearm. So we talk about the use of the firearm because that's the most serious use of force that an officer has. So we talk about, we have part of our policy talks about drawing, displaying, and pointing a firearm. Now, an officer is permitted to draw in or display a firearm in the exercise of sound judgment and has reason to fear for his or her own safety or the safety of others. As she or she approaches a suspect engaged in felony activities, approaches a suspect believed to be armed and dangerous, conducts felony vehicle stops, displays as a visible show of force or deterrent to curb deadly force. And then in high-risk situations such as hold up or hold up alarms at banks or credit unions, burglary in progress responses, drug-related arrests and raids, building searches, shots fired or individual men with gun complaints, but not limited to unknown problems, In situations involving a strong possibility of danger, officers should carry their firearm in a position that will facilitate its speedy and safe use. While pointing a firearm by an officer is an indication that he or she is prepared to use it, the fact that she or he had done so obviously should not be interpreted by the officer as they have an obligation to fire. Meaning just because you've taken your gun out of your holster doesn't mean you have to stop pulling the trigger. In order to avoid confusion, misunderstanding, or misidentification of police personnel, a standardized challenge is recommended when initial voice command is utilized by an officer who points a firearm at a potentially dangerous suspect. The challenge shall immediately identify the officer as a police officer and then shall give clear and concise instructions to the suspect. Slang words or phrases and obscenity should be avoided as they may be misinterpreted. The standard challenge of police don't move is strongly recommended. So we have it in two areas of our policy about giving a warning before using a firearm. Now, if it comes to the point that an officer does have to use their firearm, we have our procedure concerning post-shooting incident procedures, and this is actually based again on state law. In all instances involving the use of deadly force, regardless whether death or injury occurs, the Office of the Attorney General protocol and the reporting investigation of the use of deadly force will be followed. So basically what this means, if the officers use deadly force or they fire their gun at someone or something, the Attorney General's office is called in, and they're the ones that conduct that investigation. And then the following talks about they have exclusive jurisdiction for the direction and control of any criminal investigation of a law enforcement officer. So we have an outside agency, and this is statewide, have an outside agency that comes in and conducts the investigation into any use of deadly force. And this is the criteria that the Attorney General's office goes on. This is part of our policy, but it gives the direction of that they have to be notified. So it's the use of physical force that in fact causes death or serious bodily injury. The use of physical force under circumstances that in fact create a substantial risk of causing death or serious bodily injury, whether or not death or injury actually results. The use of physical force when it's the officer's intent to cause death or serious bodily injury, whether or not death or injury actually results. The discharge of a firearm in the general direction of another person or at a moving vehicle, whether or not the projectile hits the person or the vehicle. If the officer were to ram an occupied vehicle, a roadblock set up to terminate a vehicle pursuit when the roadblock in fact creates a substantial risk of causing death or serious bodily injury to the occupants of the fleeing vehicle or other persons, and that results in death or serious bodily injury, that would be an instance where we would contact the Attorney General's office. So if an officer does use deadly force, we have a policy that, this continues where that officer is placed on administrative leave. So any employee involved in an incident involving the use of physical force or action resulting in the serious injury or death of another person will be relieved of patrol field duty without loss of pay until such time as the chief of police deems a return to work is appropriate. And what we do for that is within 24 hours following the incident, the involved employee shall undergo a post-critical incident debriefing with a competent police psychologist as designated by the chief of police, and subsequent psychological services required by the employee as a result of the incident shall be provided at the department's expense. We do have the training for the use of our firearms. It's the policy of the Lewiston Police Department that officers be completely trained and subsequently maintained in the lawful and proper application of deadly force and in the safe care, use, and handling of firearms. The level of training shall meet or exceed the standards adopted by the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. And we have several officers that are firearms use of force range instructors here at the police department that are trained through the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. So we're able to hold our own training here. And part of that is we have to record the qualifying courses, be properly approved and registered with Maine Criminal Justice Academy. We document it. We have a training coordinator, or we keep track of all that. And any officer failing to qualify with his or her issued sidearm shall receive remedial training until such time as qualifications is achieved. Under no circumstances shall an officer be allowed to carry a firearm until qualified. So we talked about the guns and the deadly force, but in reality, that happens very, very infrequently here in the Lewiston Police Department. So we do a lot of training on the less lethal force. We usually do it twice a year since I've become chief, but now what I'm going to start doing is every month do 2 hours of hands-on training with the officers and the detectives and the supervisors. And we're going to have what I call MARC trainers, which are mechanics of restraint and control instructors. We'll pick a different topic to do every month, and my officers will get 2 hours of hand-on training. And again, that training covers empty-handed defense and restraint tactics, proper use of OC. And OC is what you might consider as mace. It's olerescent capsicum. It's actually, it burns your eyes, but it's based on cayenne pepper. We do not have tear gas here at the police department. We do not have rubber bullets here at the police department. The proper use of the taser, handcuffing techniques, weapon retention, and any other state-of-the-art tactics that are deemed applicable by the principal self-defense instructor. And they take that direction from the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. So what they're teaching is what we teach here. And then again, as with the lethal force, the less than lethal force, again, if anybody fails to qualify with the taser, the OC spray, or the MARC training, they will have to continue with that training. They cannot carry the items and they can't work the road till they do that. Part of our policy, and this has been, I've been here since 1990. I want to say since 91, the Lewiston Police Department does not authorize the use of neck restraints and does not give instructions to its officers in the use of neck restraints. The officers are given instruction and approved methods of mechanics, arrest, restraint, and control, and these methods are approved methods to be used by the officers of the Lewiston Police Department. And every time an officer uses force, if they draw their gun, they display their gun, they use the taser, they take their taser out, they have to grab somebody and they have to use one of the takedown methods, we fill out what we call a response to resistance report. And folks might think that it's a use of force, but it's called a response to resistance report here at the police department. And anytime an officer fills that out, in addition to the report they complete, they then fill out this form and they go through it. I'm going to show you what that form looks like. So those reports are reviewed by their immediate supervisor and then reviewed by the deputy chief of police to make sure that all policies and procedures were followed correctly. And annually, the deputy chief of police conducts analysis of all response to resistance reports. So we can review those. And I sent to you folks. I don't know if you had a chance to review those, but those were submitted to you. So this is, I know it looks kind of washed out, a little white out, but this is a response to resistance form. So you have the date occurred, the officer name, incident location, nature of incident, number of officers involved, citizens at the scene, uniformed officers. We go through the age, the height, the weight, the date of birth of the individual, whether or not they're under the influence of alcohol, any drugs, if they were mentally impaired, if they were assaultive. We go through officer injury, treated for injury. And then what it does, if you see on the left-hand side, it says sequence. So verbal commands would be usually one, and they say what they said and what the effectiveness was. And then you do, what was the next thing that did? Did you use OC? Did you go hands-on? And what often happens is an officer will give somebody verbal directions, and many times people will be initially compliant. And then as the officer moves closer to the person to put handcuffs on them, that's actually the most dangerous time for the interaction between the officer and the individual they're about to arrest. Because once you actually, grab their hand or grab their wrist to put the handcuffs on, that's when the realization to some people say, oh no, I'm getting arrested. And that's when they will struggle and fight and try to flee from the officers. So oftentimes that's why you'll see maybe it goes verbal commands and it goes right to hands-on, because initially the person is compliant and then they decide they don't want to get arrested. I also will point out where it says date of birth, gender, and race. We only started back in 2016. I directed when I became the interim or acting chief to start tracking race. So the data that was requested, I only can go back 4 years because prior to that, we don't have that. And I'll discuss some of those, the data that I gave you folks, later if we have time tonight. Same thing with taser, firearm, and you see at the bottom of this, the supervisor, watch commander, any comments or recommendations, and same thing with the deputy chief. If there's a need for remedial training, that will also be documented here, and that officer will get some training. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is kind of long-winded here. I know I'm kind of talking a lot, but in terms of what we keep track of, and it kind of give you an example, and if you looked at some of the use of force that I sent to you, it might not have made a lot of sense because there were a lot of different numbers. I'm going to give you an example here. So say an officer is operating the cruiser and observes a car that's been stolen. And then they get in a chase with that car, and then the vehicle, the suspect, eventually stops. So inside the car is the driver and say 3 passengers. So the officer calls for assistance. doesn't approach, doesn't get in the confrontation yet, and 2 other police officers arrive at his location. All 3 officers exit their cruisers and conduct what we would call a felony stop, where they get over their PA system and they call out directions, ask the driver to take the keys out of the car and then come out, hands up, one at a time. All of these officers draw their weapons and point them at the car. So these 3 officers now have to fill out a response to resistance form. And you have to do it because there's 4 people, and there's 3 officers. So for each officer, they're saying, well, I pointed my gun at the car. So that's the 4 that are in there plus the 3. So that's what they have to fill out. The driver exits the car and runs away. One of the officers chases after the driver. The officer holsters his firearm and then chases after the driver and tackles him. That's another response to resistance. The driver begins to fight with the officer, and the officer uses his OC spray to subdue and arrest the driver. That's another response to resistance. The 3 passengers in the car flee. One officer chases after one of them and tackles the passenger. This officer now has another response to resistance to fill out. The passenger then complies with the officer's commands and is taken into custody. This officer has no further response to resistance. Another officer chases after a second passenger, and the passenger stops and is taken into custody without further resistance. This officer only has the 1 response to resistance when he pointed his firearm initially at the car. A 4th officer arrives to try to catch one of the fleeing passengers, able to catch the passenger who stops voluntarily and is taken into custody. So this officer has no response to resistance form to fill out. So in this example, there are 6 response to resistance incidents that are reviewed to make sure that they are in compliance with the police department policy. So we almost over-document everything. And that's why we try to keep track of each and every time officers use any type of force. We're keeping track of that and making sure that it's in line with policy and with state law. And then we have the different less than lethal force weapons here, and that's part of the policy. We have handcuffs and flat cuffs. So this policy talks about, all suspects who have been arrested shall be handcuffed to preserve custody and ensure the safety of the officers and others involved. All suspects arrested for Class D and E crimes may be handcuffed as long as necessary. For the protection of officers and the preservation of the scene, suspect may be handcuffed during the execution of search warrants and during felony vehicle stops when there exists reasonable belief that failing to do so would place the officers and other persons at risk or would afford the suspects an opportunity to escape or destroy evidence. So that's why oftentimes if, say, we do go in and do a search warrant at a home where we're concerned about some violence or drugs or weapons, everybody in that apartment may be handcuffed who may be a threat to the officers, but there may only be one person who's actually on the, on the warrant to be arrested. So those people would not be arrested, but we make sure that everyone is safe while we're in there and we search and make sure that the people aren't, sitting on couches next to a gun or anything like that on the couch cushions. So that would be an incident where they would handcuff everyone when they go in there. We talk about the prescribed method of handcuffing shall be with the hands to the back, palms out, and handcuffs should be double locked to prevent unnecessary tightness. An officer should be watchful for any bodily injury or impairment which could be aggravated as a result of handcuffing. Handcuffing with the hands to the front shall be at the officer's discretion when the potential for injury is questionable or when transporting a prisoner over a long distance. We don't bring prisoners here to the Lewiston Police Department. We take them over to the Androscoggin County Jail. So we have to have our prisoners handcuffed when we take them in there. More often than not, the handcuffs are to the back, but there are instances where the handcuffs are in the front. If there's someone who has an injury, then that will occur that way. When using handcuffs to the front, officers shall transport chains whenever practical. Transport chains are chains that actually wrap around almost like a belt that would go through somebody's belt loops, and then the handcuffs are attached to that so they aren't having their arms bent behind their back. So I talked a little bit about OC, olerescent capsicum, which you may common term would be mace. That's the only one that's used by the department. It's non-flammable. And we say that because if, say, you used some OC that was flammable and then for some reason you had to use your taser, we don't want people catching on fire. So we don't have anything everything we use is non-flammable. OC agents may be used when physical force is necessary to protect an officer from assault, subduing a subject who is resisting arrest. Deter persons who fail to disperse, as defined in, again, this is state law, 17A, 502. Subdue or disperse a crowd who are engaging in conduct constituting a failure to disperse, riot, or engaging in unlawful assembly, as defined by, and then again, main state law, 17A, 502, 503, and 504. We instruct our officers not to use the OC agent, should not be used if resistance is minor and not hazardous, or if physical powers with reason to achieve the same end, shall not be used on cooperative subjects. Under no circumstances shall OC agents MK46. MK46 is about the size of a small fire extinguisher. And that's not be used on cooperative crowds or crowds engaging in a more peaceful sort of protest, which would not constitute a riot or involving disorderly conduct. And that's separate training, has to be taught for that, as opposed to the handheld ones that the officers use. Again, as with the deadly force, whenever practical, a verbal warning should be issued prior to using OC agents. Example, please cooperate, I'll have to spray you. A verbal warning must be issued prior to deploying OC agents. Example, this is a warning to disperse. That would be for a large crowd. We've never had to use that here either. And of course, the deployment of the OC agent, an escape route for the crowd must be established. You don't want to pin people in and they have nowhere to go, and it really is just aggravate and cause a confrontation. And again, officers shall not be authorized to carry or to use OC agents unless having first been thoroughly trained in their proper use. And then the MK46 requires its own specific training. Whenever OC agents are used, we have to make sure that the person is treated as soon as practical. Consists of an eye wash using equipment. We have some here at our police department, also at the Anscogna County Jail. And again, when they use the OC, the officer shall prepare a detailed incident report citing the circumstances of the incident, the justification for the use of it, what type and how soon treatment was provided, and the report shall be submitted to the watch commander. Again, that's their written report, and then the response to resistance form. I used to be an instructor for defensive tactics here at the police department a long time ago. So I used to have to get sprayed in the face every year by the OC. It burns your eyes. It's an uncomfortable feeling. But in reality, even if you don't wash it out with water, the effects usually fade about 45 minutes or so. But we have a policy. I don't think I've given that to you yet, or if you want it, but transported prisoners, anytime anybody asks for medical attention, we take them over not over to the jail. We take them to either St. Mary's or CMMC. We have 2 hospitals here. So all my officers know that if anybody asks for medical attention, they get taken. We also have in-cameras, cruiser cameras in our cruisers, and our officers' policy is they will record all transportations from when they arrest the person to whatever location they're taking them. So we could review that after the fact if there were issues that came up. Now we'll talk about the taser. Again, as with the OC, as with the firearms, only officers who have satisfactorily completed the training, they have to do that annually. I have instructors here who are taser instructors, and only those that have completed the testing and the certification can carry that. The deployment is the taser to be considered as a response to resistance to use of force on a level greater than what would constitute a decision to respond using OC spray after when compliance techniques and skill are not effective or feasible. Therefore, members of this agency will utilize OC spray prior to the use of taser whenever practical. Each deployment of taser shall be investigated and documented again using the response to resistance form. This includes a contact drive stun. I'll explain what that is. So the way the taser works is it shoots out these 2 little barbs, and you try to aim for the individual's back. And what it does is it then spreads the electric current, which knocks the person off their feet. So what the drive stun does is you take off the cartridge that has the barbs in it, and it's more of, I think, what people may think of like a stun gun, where it would cause just direct pain in just that area. And even if they did drive stun, they would have to fill out this form, as well as completing their written report. Any deployment of the taser shall be done in a manner so to avoid multiple, repeated, prolonged, and continuous, and that's CEW, that's electrical charge exposure, unless necessary to counter reasonable perceived threats and is legally justified to accomplish the legitimate operational goal. What happens is in the training, the officers learn once they tase someone, the other officers can come over and handcuff the person when they're down off their feet and they're no longer being aggressive towards the officers. The taser should only be utilized on a subject who is explicitly communicating intent or engaging in active, aggressive resistance against an officer or exhibiting active aggression through words or actions of immediate threat to the safety of an officer. This includes the use to incapacitate a person who poses the threat of physical injury to self-suicidal. So that would be as, and unfortunately it has happened over the years, of say someone's threatening to kill themselves, a suicide by cop. We use the taser instead of, I don't want to shoot somebody who's having some mental health issues, having a mental breakdown and wanting to be killed. So that would be a situation that we could use the taser. And then again, it talks about where, I think I discussed that already, the primary target area. Prohibited uses of the taser. You can't use it as a punitive or a coercive manner. You can't use it on a handcuffed or a secured prisoner. The use of the taser in drive stun mode is a pain compliance tool in certain circumstances of encountering active aggressive resistance against an officer. As outlined in instructive training, it's considered to be less than intrusive fashion, so they could use it in the drive stun. On any suspect running, unless that person demonstrates an overt intention to use violence or force against the officer or another person. Violently resist detention, arrest, and other alternatives for controlling them are not reasonable available. And then again, the section of the law of them trying to escape is 17A law. And then this is, I've referred to this a couple of times, section 107, physical force and law enforcement. This is the law. I've given that to you. I think you folks can read that over unless you want me to go through that. And I'm sure you probably don't. Prohibited the use of taser, continue in an environment where an officer knows that a potentially flammable, volatile, or explosive material is present, including but not limited to OC spray from an outside agency. So if we were assisting Auburn or the Sheriff's Department, I don't know, what they use, or the state police will come into town now and then. We want to make sure that the OC that they're using is non-flammable. In any environment where the subject's fall could reasonably result in death, such as in deep water with an inability for immediate retrieval or on an elevated structure. So if somebody's standing on the side of a bridge saying, I'm going to jump and kill myself, we're not going to use the taser. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of us even being there. Or on a person who's operating a vehicle or machinery, because then we're going to end up crashing into something and hurting someone else that we may not have happened if we didn't use the taser on them. Again, as with all uses of force, certain individuals may be more susceptible to injury. Officers should be aware of the greater potential for injury when using a taser against subjects in the elevated risk population, such as children, the elderly, persons of small stature, irrespective of age, or those who the officer has reason to believe are pregnant, equipped with a pacemaker, or an obvious ill health. Officers must keep in mind the person may be suffering from excited delirium. If the officer believes the subject is suffering from excited delirium, medical attention shall be sought. Upon firing the device, the officer shall energize the subject the least number of cycles and no longer than necessary to accomplish the legitimate operational objective. Then we talk about drive stun, and that's just kind of what I explained. This involves removing the cartridge and pressing the exposed electric probes of the unit against an appropriate area of the body based on training, primarily a pain compliance tool. Then the aftercare. The taser probes may be removed from the subject by the officer after the subject is restrained following procedures outlined in training. It shall be the practice that individuals who have been incapacitated by a taser shall be taken to emergency medical facility for evaluation. The following person shall be transported to a medical facility for evaluation and removal of probes following exposure to a taser. Any person who, again, requests medical attention for removal is hit in a sensitive area. Now, oftentimes, again, the training is for the back, but people will move, jump around. It could not go where the officer initially wanted. We're aiming. For officers who have difficulty removing the probes, does not appear to recover properly after being hit by the probes. An ambulance on-scene emergency response and care shall be ordered for situations which manifest that the subject person is exhibiting signs of excited delirium. And then excited delirium is defined as a state of mind that is manifested amongst other things by incoherence, violence, and uncooperativeness, commonly caused by drugs or psychiatric illness, which has been associated with deaths in custody. We're currently seeing a lot of folks using meth here in town. My officers are telling me it's, people look like they're spasming, jumping around, just can't control their bodies, and even some of them are having conversations with people when the officers show up and they're thrashing. I had a video of a woman slamming her head repeatedly on Walnut Street that my officers showed up at. So obviously that's not someone, that's acting normally. So those folks were, exhibiting signs of excited delirium. So they, of course, were transported to the hospital. Other signs of excited delirium include overheating, which manifests by profuse sweating, disrobing, violence towards glass, superhuman strength, self-mutilation, where I talk about the woman smashing her head repeatedly off the ground, and disturbances in breathing patterns. And the personnel receive annual training in accordance with the guidelines and the certification. Now, use of impact projectile. This is something we got about 3 years ago. This is the beanbag that we shoot out of a shotgun. This is not used on crowds. This is more of a, in terms of incident with a suicidal person. You know, we live here in Maine and the weather gets cold. I know it's pretty warm right now, but oftentimes we'll be dealing with folks who have many layers of clothing on, big jackets, and then the taser will really not have any use against them. So this part of the impact projectile is when and how to use less than lethal impact projectiles. Again, if someone's suicidal, I don't want to have my officers shooting them. I want them to take them into custody and get them the help they need. This can assist officers in de-escalation of potentially violent confrontations and provide additional alternatives to the use of deadly force. Impact projectiles are an important component of this agency. Less than lethal force equipment officers are authorized to employ impact projectiles in accordance with provisions of this policy and the overall response to resistance policy. And less than lethal weapons, devices used by police officers to stop, control, and restrain individuals while causing less harm than deadly force. And examples are pepper spray, tasers, and beanbag projectiles. They're primarily designed for use against subjects who appear to pose a threat, death, or serious bodily injury to themselves or others. I can say we've never used it here. We have it. It's kind of a just in case thing, and I'm glad that we haven't had to use it at this point. But it's the way I'm seeing the different types of drugs that are coming here. I wouldn't be surprised that in the next year or so we end up having to use this, but right now we haven't. Suspects who are struck with a projectile should be restrained as necessary and transported to a medical facility for examination. And then again, it's the same thing with the use of force and the response to resistance, as I discussed with the other items. Impact weapons, we have expandable batons and a police riot baton. Expandable batons are only by officers who are certified to use that, shall be worn by all uniformed patrol officers, and is an optional carry for officers in plain clothes assignment. And if the officers are in plain clothes, they have to carry their badge and identification in a visible manner or display it. Riot baton is available only for use in emergency situations, shall be maintained in the equipment room or stored in the critical incident response vehicle. Because of the potential for injury, the police baton should only be utilized after lesser force has failed. It would be obviously futile. I cannot remember the last time anyone here has used one of the expandable batons, except maybe to break a window to get someone out of a vehicle that's been trapped, in a car accident or something like that. But it may be utilized by an officer in defense or self-defense of another when it becomes necessary to subdue a person violently resisting arrest in order to deter persons who are physically violent or engage in riotous conduct. When the use of police baton becomes necessary, the following guidelines will be followed. The police baton should not be raised above the head to deliver a blow. Blows from the police baton shall be made in a sharp and deliberate motion and shall be directed to the appropriate target areas. So part of the training the officers receive in the use of the baton are the different target areas. So level 1 areas are target areas selected for blocking and striking, which are the least likely to result in serious injury to a person. These targets include the forearm, the buttocks, the thigh, the shin, the Achilles tendon, the instep, and the lower abdomen. Then there are level 2 areas may be selected when blocks and strikes to a level 1 blocking and striking target fail to conclude an attempted assault. Level 2 targets include upper arm, elbow joint, inside of the wrist, back of the hand, knee joint, shoulder blades, collarbone, and upper abdomen. Level 3 areas should be selected only when blocks and strikes at level 1 and level 2 do not succeed on the first or second try or do not correspond to the level of danger perceived. Officers must have a reason to fear that they are in danger of great bodily harm or death if a level 3 target areas are used to block or strike in self-defense. That would be as if you're going to use deadly force, if you're going to use your firearm. Level 3 target areas include bridge of nose, temple, eyes, ears, jaw, upper lip, face, back of the head, hollow behind the ear, throat, back of the neck, solar plexus, rib cage, groin, kidney, spine, and tailbone. Whenever the police baton is employed, the officer shall again prepare the detailed incident report, justification, any injuries, and what type of treatment was sought for the person if they were injured. So we do have a Pepperball system. These are small pepper balls that the same OC that a shot at somebody, but the shot at the ground, and then it dissipates in the air up in front of them. It's a non-lethal system combining the capsicum and kinetic energy. It should be used only in situations where a subject has exhibited violent or potentially violent behavior that threatens the safety of himself or others. We have never used this either. Only officers who have been trained in the use of the pepperball system are authorized to use this form of control. When deploying the pepperball system, officers shall avoid intentionally targeting the following areas: face, neck, or spine. When practicable, the pepperball system shall be utilized with the approval of a supervisor. Officers shall allow a subject who has been exposed to the pepperball system, same as with the OC or the mace that the officers carry, to decontaminate as soon as possible after exposure. And other weapons. Officers are prohibited from carrying unauthorized weapons at any time. And I think that's it. Yes, it is. So I know I went over a lot, and I'm going to try to get the screen back. Maybe I won't.
I'm going to help you out, Chief.
Thank you.
I have some control here, so we just get rid of it.
So that is the our response to resistance policy. And I gave you, I'm pretty sure, let's see what else I think I sent to you, so those use of force analysis, I think that was one of the questions that asked of how do we keep track of that? So that's done yearly, and that's one of our CALIA reports that we do every year.
We did get that.
Okay.
Or I did look at it. Did everybody receive that email? Because it did come just recently.
Chief, I had a question for you.
Sure.
So in terms of deadly force and mere suspicion, what's the mere suspicion kind of leaves a broad spectrum. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, that was an unauthorized use, Mr.
Okay.
Morgan, of mere suspicion.
Okay. Okay. I'll take that.
Time for conversation and question, correct? Because on our agenda, it says that there's a space, but I'm assuming that's because this is the Q&A part of Chief O'Malley's presentation, and then we'll have time to open up. We'll have time to open up for public comment.
Sure.
Right. So.
Yeah.
One other question for you, Chief. How long has it been required to document resistance? Because I know you said that since you've come, you've kind of initiated and issued.
Well, what I said was, Mr. Morgan, when I became acting chief, we started tracking race, but we've always been documenting use of force. It wasn't until 2016 that I added race onto the form.
Okay.
Elgin?
I kind of know the answer to this, but for anybody that's watching and the panel, can you walk through some of the things that officer, when they come across somebody in terms of their body language, dropping the center of the gravity? Can you go over some of that, that officer would kind of start reading people?
Well, I mean, oftentimes, an officer, if they're dealing with somebody starts staring at the officer's gun. You'll see the person will clench and unclench their fists. If you have somebody with training, and even if not, sometimes the individual will get a bladed stance, meaning turning their body sideways as if to get ready to attack the officers. A lot of times when we're dealing with folks who are, under the influence of drugs or alcohol, like I described with a woman smashing her head on the ground on Walnut Street about 6 months ago, you're not really sure what the person's going to do. So the officers often have to take the tact of, this whole 6 feet distance, for the COVID, my officers, they're always trying to keep themselves a couple arm lengths away from people anyways, just so they can react, because your reaction time is based on how close you are to somebody. So you want to make sure you have distance from somebody. So if they are going to grab hold of you or go after you, you have a chance to react, because it's action and reaction of what the issues are.
Mayor, you're muted, sir.
It's kind of weird not running a meeting. So, so Chief, I know it's been almost a decade since I've been in law enforcement, but I recall my training with OC spray and the taser the officers actually had to be sprayed and then actually shot with the taser. Is that still part of training?
Yeah, every time I hire somebody before we send them up to the police academy, we do tase them so they have an appreciation for that taser and saying, oh, this better be really serious for me to tase somebody because I know what that's going to feel like. So I make sure that they all get tased, at least that first time. They don't have to do it to be recertified in it. The OC, we don't make them get sprayed if they want to, but more often than not, they don't volunteer for that. But if I had my choice, I would rather be hit with OC, sprayed with mace, than tased. But yes, I give them that. I don't give them an option. I say this is a requirement for you to work here.
Okay, thank you.
Noel?
Thank you so much for that, Chief. And maybe this is a question that you can't answer now, but I'm just wondering what conversations may or may not be occurring around not using all of these approaches. Are there some approaches that you all are thinking that you want to leave behind as you kind of move into the next iteration of this kind of engagement with the community?
When we look at those yearly reports and then we see where there's injury to the officers or their injury to the individual that we're arresting, hands-on is when we're having issues. So I would much rather have my officers use the OC spray because yes, it's uncomfortable, but you're not having any long-lasting injuries. You're not having people thrashing around on the ground. As I said about the baton, I can't remember the last time that's been used. I mean, I looked at what I provided to you folks and there was no use of the baton for, I don't know if I went back I was able to go back 4 years anyways. But it's a tool in the toolbox that we use, but in reality, it doesn't get used that often, but I think I don't want to take it away from people. You know, when you talk about using that baton, if you're doing and the areas I described, those level 3 areas, basically it's your head and it's the center of your body. If you use the baton there, that's very dangerous and you can do some serious harm to somebody. And I think that's a lot of times why the officers don't use it, because it'd be one thing if I was to stand there the whole time and you could pick where you're going to hit me. But if we're moving or I'm grabbing you or we're rolling around the ground and fighting, it's very hard for the officers to hit exactly where they're trying to hit because of the movement. It's always a dynamic, it's always changing situation. So we go based on what the police academy teaches and then we continue with that. But in realities, here at the Lewiston Police Department, we haven't used the batons. You know, we do use the taser, we do use the OC, not as much as I'd like, but as I explained earlier, when I get closer to somebody and I'm going to say, okay, you're under arrest, turn around, put your hands behind your back. And they say, okay. And I come in and then I get closer to them. So I'm not having this 4 to 6 feet distance, that safety distance. When I move in, and even when the officer puts that first click on somebody's wrist, that's when the reality sinks into people. They'll swing around, they'll swing at the officer with the handcuffed on their hand. So now they've got this metal weapon in their hands. And that's when the officer have to grab them and throw them to the ground or do a technique to get them to the ground. So I can honestly say we haven't had those discussions because I don't want to take away that tool. I want to make sure they have those options, because when I came on the police department, we had a gun and a big stick, and that's all we had. And those weren't the best options, especially when we have so many more folks with substance use issues, mental health issues that are on the street, that I don't want to say, okay, here's the gun and the baton and have at it. So I want to have those different options available so that we're not inflicting, you know, using lethal force on somebody when if we had a different option, we wouldn't have to. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It does. Just a second part of that question, if there was something that you identified that you didn't want to use, even though it's taught in the academy, do independent police departments have autonomy over deciding what tools they do and do not offer to their officers?
You could offer, well, you could not offer something. I mean, you can't teach something different that the academy isn't teaching. So if I said, okay, I don't want anybody to carry expandable batons anymore, I wouldn't have to carry expandable batons anymore. But I couldn't add something to it that isn't taught through the academy, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Tanya, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all of that information, Chief O'Malley. The question that I have is really based on, I think you said it was either 2006 or 2016, you had race added to the
2016.
2016. Can you tell me what made you do that change? I mean, I appreciate it, but
well, part of our CALIA certification that was part of it. So that's why our policies can ever be changing. And it was, I think, June or July of 2016. So I said, we need to add this on because our last accreditation, they had asked us about that and we weren't keeping track of that. So when I came in, so we just had to go back and hand search, about 6 months worth of work so we could get those numbers for 2016. But that's what CALIA does for us. It says it's the best practices going forward. And that was why I said, okay, this is what they were looking for because I was the deputy chief said, and we didn't have those numbers for them. I said, we need to update our forms.
Okay, thank you.
Mark? You're muted. You can keep yourself off mute. You are.
I'm gonna from now on. So, Chief, you noted that change was because of a CALIA notation in their report to you. How often does that happen? First, can you tell us how often CALIA does a review of the department, and how many policies have you actually changed? And I know you have to give a ballpark probably, but does that happen regularly after an inspection?
Well, we do there's a yearly review where they have certain policies that we're reviewing for the year. And we've just gone to the 4-year review because we were a gold standard, meaning we had met and we exceeded so many of the policies. So it used to be every 3 years where they come in and they do a complete review, but once a year they do certain sections. So by year 4, they're looking at what you've already done for each year, and then they do a 4th year. So then they give you your final assessment and final either approval or what you need to fix. So it's yearly, and then it's a 4-year final.
And so every year, is there policy changes made because of CALIA?
Oh, yes, definitely. I know that they just recently put out some and kind of what we already had for some of these other agencies in terms of the duty to intervene. I know there were a couple other ones, but we have all that we keep.
And a CALIA report, is that public, a public document?
Parts of it they are. Like one of the reports, what did I send to you? The IA is actually posted on the city website. We post that every year.
Okay, thank you.
Elgin?
Just so people have for kind of educational purpose, can you tell people what kind of training that a new officer that goes to the academy would experience before they kind of come back to you?
Well, that was
as far as this subject.
Well, they will. I mean, I have that part of my training, but I mean, there's 700 and I don't know 720 or something hours that they get up at the police academy. When they would come back, I mean, we actually do training with them here. They go up to the academy and then they come back. Then we put them on a 3-month field training officer program where they again go over policy reviews, the hands-on, the firearms, things like that, driving. So we do, because we are CALIA certified, there's some departments that have what they call green pins, which are reserve officers that have a certain amount of training, but they can't do certain things. They can't get in pursuits. They can't investigate certain crimes. As a CALIA agency, we don't have reserve officers or part-time officers, what we would call a green pin. We have what's called a blue pin, so they have to have completed all that training and then complete our 3-month FTO training program. And I'll go through all that when we go. And I don't have it right in front of me. It's on one of my PowerPoints here, but the training at the police academy and what they require. And there's CIT training, which is crisis intervention training. They've really expanded a lot. I know when I went to the police academy, it was only 3 months long. Now it's 18 weeks. So they've actually expanded quite a bit. I know we can always do better, but it's just a matter of time and money, obviously, up at the police academy.
So if we got about 15 minutes, I'm not sure if you have people waiting in this. Oh, hey, Luke, go ahead.
Thanks, Aisha. Just a couple quick questions. So if an officer is involved in a situation where they draw their firearm, like precautionary, but they end up like not using it, do we have any guidance for officers on when they should kind of start to, maybe put the firearm away, or is it entirely up to their discretion? And then,
well, as I read through the display and whatever, and then they keep track of it. They have to fill out response to resistance. So if all of a sudden the supervisor is saying, why do you keep taking your gun out every time you get out of the car? I mean, if it's not an appropriate situation, Luke, we would address that.
Okay. So there's nothing like at this specific point in the situation, like you should probably put it away. It's more just like discretionary.
Correct.
Okay. And the other question is like,
and Luke, more often than not, when it's a situation where the firearm, so it's a hold-up alarm or it's a burglar in progress, say it's 2 o'clock in the morning, we get an alarm in one of our businesses, the door's open. More often than not, a supervisor will go as well. To be in one of the more serious scenes, the supervisor will be there as well.
okay, right on. The other one was if say officers pulled their firearms in a situation that was like total misunderstanding, and then the people that they drew it on, had done nothing wrong, does the department have any kind of follow-up with that individual?
With the officers or with the individual that they pulled the firearms on?
The person that had the firearms pulled on them.
Well, that would be, at the scene, the supervisor, and then if the person, makes a complaint against the police officer, we would follow up that way. But oftentimes, look, we see things on TV, like I just saw, was it out in Aurora, Colorado last night, where they had this whole family handcuffed, 3 or 4 of them laying on their stomachs. They had gone to get their nails done or something. That oftentimes is, they apparently have a policy. Anytime you have a stolen car, you'll follow this policy. We give our officers, let's use a little common sense. You got a 6-year-old, you got the aunt, you got the cousin, and they're all going, it's clearly not a situation like that. So that's what makes a lot of us look bad, Luke, where sometimes common sense goes flying out the window and then it ends up on Lester Holt showing it on the 6:30 news.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I guess I just like to see the department have more of an outreach in those types of situations, because I know I was in a similar situation in high school and no one reached out to me, and that could have gone a long way. So it could be beneficial to the department to make that a practice. Just a thought. But thanks.
Yep.
I just have one more question. When it comes to complaints against police officers for policy violations, you notice, is it more of an issue with younger officers, older officers? I mean, I don't believe it's a major issue at Lewiston PD, but clearly every department gets those complaints. Do you track like the ages of the officer? Is it usually because?
Well, we track the officers. I don't track what their ages are, but we track the officers. And we know the younger officers. I mean, we tend to get more driving issues with our younger officers than we do other older ones. There's often an eagerness of the younger ones to get to the scene right away and be the first one there to help people. And oftentimes they may use a little poor judgment in terms of the speeds they're using during the time of the day, things like that. That's where I see the younger ones have a little bit more of an issue with their driving.
Go ahead, Tanya.
So Chief, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe when I asked during our last meeting about how many officers were CIT trained, I believe you said 44. Is that around?
I want to say it's 40, and actually because we were, but the older ones, now the younger ones get the CIT training. So we've been focusing on our older officers. I mean, I'm actually CIT trained from the late 90s. But what we're doing is, because of COVID, CIT hasn't been, NAMI hasn't been doing the training. So we're going to bring Laurie Sarah Martell in, and she's going to do another version of that to get the rest of them. So, I mean, that's over half of our department is, and it's required by the state that at least 20% of your department be CIT trained, and we're over half right now. And my goal is to get everybody trained in that.
Sure. And, the reason that I asked is when you were going over the, say a suspect is under the influence of some substance, I saw that video of that person like banging, I saw a video like that. There's a lot of co-occurring too. There's a lot of mental health and substance use issues. And what can look as resistance can also be a reaction to trauma based on interaction with law enforcement. So that's why I asked. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Luke, I think you had your hand raised. I don't know if it was a mistake. If not, Howell, you can go ahead.
Hi, Chief. I was wondering, the videos that you use, like for the training, the scenarios. I know you use a different kind of scenarios, but one of your videos, do you have like a scenario of other cultures that, you know, show it like a scenario that if incident happened to those type of people, how will you like react, or, you know, what situation do you use? Like, I know some situations, like some videos are not, you know, they're outdated. So is your, like, basically what I'm saying is the videos that you use for the training, are they diverse?
Well, we do a lot of, well, in terms of, well, I'm going to try to answer this. In terms of like the hands-on training for the tasers and the OC and things like that, there's no videos involved in that's all hands-on training. We go through CIT, we use them for training. They do some scenarios, like we had verbal judo that was interactive. So if you're asking me, can I show you videos? I really can't. We do use, and again, we're kind of getting off topic here and I don't want to run out of time. We use a company called JPMA for training in terms of different lesson plans. I would definitely say that we do have some training on the cultural differences, however, in terms of, you know, when some cultures, they won't look you in the eye, they're going to look down, and some people in other cultures will say, oh, well, they're lying because they're not looking at us. They do get some cultural training that way. We could definitely do better. I know in the past, Zamzam Muhammad has come in and done a presentation. So has Fatuma with Bright that works for her. I know when I was a younger person here, about 10 or so, 15, maybe even longer, we'd had people come in and do some cultural differences in terms of not shaking hands, things like that. We definitely need to improve in that area, how I can tell you that.
So if there are no more, are there any more questions from the committee? Do we have any public comment?
I would just recommend, it takes a few seconds, Aisha, when you announce it, that we're at public comment. Sometimes with the internet takes people a few seconds to raise their hand. So now that you've opened it, I just recommend we wait a minute and see if people can open it.
Just to make sure we're really clear with the public. So now's the opportunity for the public to ask any questions or share some thoughts. And we just need you to raise your hand, which is down in the lower portion of your screen.
And Dennis, is it worth going over any public comment guidelines, or just keeping it to 3 minutes? We don't have very much time.
Right. Yes. Sure. I can cover that quickly. You should just, trying to keep comments brief. In 3 minutes or less is ideal at this point. And really, if you're going to repeat or try to keep comments new and not just repeat the same comment, from each person, just keep things moving along. That's general rule, and obviously keep it on point, and comments on subject would be helpful. You do have one member of the public that has raised their hand, Aisha. And I will allow them to talk.
Dennis, I don't have permission to bring him in, so you'll have.
Got it. Thanks, Dale. Got it right there. So you have Mr. Alex Diamond Stantic has got their hand raised for public comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
This may be a topic for a subsequent meeting, but I was just curious about bias training or any like a racial equity training that officers receive. If there's any sort of information about sort of the history of policing of communities of color and maybe the statistics that exist nationally regarding use of force for folks of color, in particular for Black and Indigenous folks.
Thank you.
So although that topic's not a part of this evening, if it's okay with the chair, I'm sure the chief could give some general information on what there is for bias training. But I think we'll have a whole lot more information once we do the training portion of our meeting. So Chief, could you respond to that for just a moment?
Yeah, we do have a policy, anti-bias policing. We also have some training that the officers, and it's online, of implicit and explicit bias training that they receive. Can we do more? Sure. He's talking about use of force nationwide. I don't have those. I've supplied to this panel the use of force breakdown. And then I think I've also, I'm pretty sure you got it as well, was the, I was able to get, that was a hand search where they were able to break down what types of force were used in terms of drawing, aiming, you know, taser, firearm, and all that stuff. But yeah, we need to do some more training, without a doubt. And like I said, in the past, we've had speakers come in, guests come in. We can talk about, you know, recruitment. That's another thing in terms of diversifying the police department, which I've been trying to do. My hope is that we can continue to diversify the police department, but we need to have the academy put on a class. I was supposed to send some officers or some candidates May 15th to the academy, but with COVID, that got sidetracked. So I've got 1, 2, 3, I've got, I think 4 or 5 right now, 4 ready to go to the police academy. I don't know when that's going to happen. And of those 4, it's 3 people of color that I'm trying to send. And there may even be a 4th one. However, I can't send anybody, I can't hire them until I can get somebody up at the police academy. But that's, I think, more for the recruitment day. So I don't want to take up time on that. Yeah.
And I think, is that all? Yes, I think that's it. So I guess that we'll move on really quickly to our next steps. We got about 10 minutes.
So I can just cover that really quick. Ayesha, the next meeting agenda our next meeting is August 19th. You know, I do believe the chief got through all of the review of these policies and procedures, you know, to this point. We did have that on this agenda just in case we needed additional time. But I would say that the next agenda will primarily be on the development of the committee recommendations on what you just heard and what we just went through this evening.
Because it was a lot of information, and I want to make sure that we are able to digest that information, especially the stuff that was recently sent. Because I did look at it. I have questions, but I would have liked to have a more informed question for you. And so I think if no one's opposed to having just a little slot on the agenda to cover those things after we've looked through them a little bit more. Cool.
And just to add to that, just to respond, I think from a staff standpoint, I think that would be, any questions would be part of that recommendation development process. So I think as, you know, we're going through that, I think that's just really part of our, what we would view normal part of the process, you know, at least when we work with our city council and workshops and those types of things, there's a question and answer process that helps that formulate those recommendations. So we're prepared for that is my point.
Hey.
And over the next 2 weeks, I would just encourage any further questions, just get them sent in. I mean, the more information we can grab before our next meeting will be really helpful for us when we're looking at, you know, the review and recommendations.
And just, can we go over how we're doing that? I know I want to make sure everyone's getting the information, seeing everyone's questions. So Dennis, is that OneNote? Was it OneNote?
Yes. Yep. So a couple things. So OneNote, you know, just to remind again, we'll send out a note through an email to all of you once we resolve the ability for you to add documents to the file. But right now you certainly can review and read and access those at this point. So all the information is there for access. What we'll do is we'll send an email out, you know, again, with that information once we have it freed. If any questions come in from any individual, you can certainly send them to me directly. I'll make sure they get to the appropriate, you know, if it's directly at the police department, or if we need to bring in our HR, I'll make sure that we navigate that and get you the information back. But our replies and information will go back to the entire committee. I think that's how we'll ensure that information. So as a committee member, you don't have to feel obligated to copy the entire committee on your question, but know that chances are the answer and everything is going to come back to everyone. So everyone has that same information.
Thank you.
Chief
Riley?
I just wanted to say, you know, I'm doing my best to gather the data because that was a lot of questions you guys gave me. Some of it is very specific, and I may not be able to get as specific as some of you want, but I'm going to try to get everything I can, and we can kind of work off of that. And a lot of it's just based on the record keeping software or system that we have. But some of it I may not be able to get, but there's a whole bunch I gave you, and I don't want to dump all of it on at once. So maybe I mean, if I could put it all in this one note, then we can kind of go through, and then next meeting, if you have questions on what I gave you for tonight, then we can go over that. I will say my crime analysis is doing some of this, and she's preparing a lot of this documentation for me. So I may have to interpret or explain to you the way she's talking and describing some of these, because it may be in police jargon that may not be as clear as I think it is when I read it.
Laura, you had something?
Yeah, and so I realize we only have a few minutes left, so I'm just kind of planting a seed. That, yeah, it was a lot of questions. It was a lot of information, and I realized that the committee didn't get a chance to really review that and make some decisions around it. So I apologize about that. And I'm wondering, is there a way for us to synthesize this information or analyze this information and or summarize within a report? Because it's a lot of information, and I think some things get lost in the details. So I was wondering if there's a way for us to be able to analyze, synthesize, summarize. And this might not happen in anticipation for the next meeting. It might need to be the meeting afterwards, but it's something that I was curious about.
Thank you for that, Laura. And Chief O'Malley, thank you so much for your presentation. Like I really appreciate your time and your thoughtful responses to our questions as well.
I did try to pare it down, believe it or not. I know it didn't seem like that. I thought I was going to lose my voice talking, but, and I know reading everything is kind of, dry, but those are the policies we have in place, and my officers have to read those. They have to sign off on it. And there's, policies that they review yearly. This isn't like a one-time thing and then they don't read it again. Another clear requirement is, the big policies in terms of force and pursuits and things like that, they have to review constantly. And like I said, I can go over that on the training, which is probably going to be a couple of meetings away, but this is going to be a couple of meetings, I think, anyways.
I think so as well. We have any last comments? Mayor Carey, do you have any comments?
So I just want to make sure, Laura, was that a question? Were you hoping for an answer to that, or more just, advising your thoughts on it?
Well, I guess it was somewhere maybe in between, because we only have a few minutes. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to kind of devise a whole system of analysis in the next few minutes, but it is a lot of information. And so I'm concerned about being able to kind of churn thoughtfully through all of it so that we can devise recommendations from that. So this might be something we need to do via the entire committee in between, but it's just something I hope we can think about how we're going to analyze this information and be able to collectively come forward with our recommendations.
So with the chair's permission, maybe you could reach out to our city administrator and kind of have that discussion with him, so that he has a general idea of what you're hoping for. Then we may, then you can kind of fill us in at our next meetings. Would that be okay, Aisha?
I think that's perfect.
Would that be all right with you?
And I want to say what Chief O'Malley sent had some breakdown, had some data that there were some holes, and maybe that's something that we can compare, like, okay, we have this information, but we're missing some stuff that we would be interested in hearing about, and not so much recreating or taking this whole step. Like I printed the stack, it's a lot. Not being able, and I thought based on the stack that I have and the presentation you gave, you did kind of do that compressing as much as you could. So I think maybe having a look at what was sent earlier for us, that may help us out a lot with how we're going to look at the data too. I just wanted to add that. Noel?
This is probably not, there's probably not time for this, but I'm just wondering if at some point we're going to discuss the Sun Journal article, and wondering what kind of pressure the chief is feeling, if you're feeling particularly wedged in between this committee and your union at this point, and what is the mayor thinking around reckoning with, having a conversation. I would worry that we would do all of this work, that we would have the chief working his full-time job and producing all of this material for us as well as all of your day jobs in this time, and then it be something that we actually cannot see through to fruition. I just wonder if moving past that article might be a mistake. But
So
I'm new to that tension, so.
I'm not sure if I think they've updated the article since I provided a response to the reporter. So if you haven't seen that, you might want to check that out. You know, I made a comment, and I'm pretty clear on this. I'm not going to let protesters who become agitators distract our work, and I'm not going to let police unions distract our work. And I'm very proud of this committee and the approach that we've taken thus far. I don't see this as an attack on anyone. I see this as community members who live here in our community who want to be part of a solution. Now, I've met with the union on a couple of occasions. I'd be happy to meet with them again. But just like my first meeting with Dane, you know, I said, I hope protesters don't make demands, you know, that they want to be part of a solution and we can work together. That's going to be the same thing with our police union. We don't need demands. We need community members who want to be part of the solution. And I'm proud of the people I chose. I think we have people who do good work around diversity. We also have current law enforcement officers, former law enforcement officers on this committee. I think we have a really well-balanced committee here. It's going to do a lot of great work, and I'm proud of this committee.
I say what he said. Chief, if we started 5 minutes after our start time, so if you want to take a minute, I'm okay with that. And again, I appreciate Mayor Kayer's remarks, and we support you. At least I do.
I have no control over what the unions are going to say. There are times, you know, that they're going to go their own way. I don't know if those folks, you remember they were wearing green T-shirts a couple of years ago during contract negotiations. I tried to dissuade them of doing that, and they wouldn't. And they grew beards and wore green T-shirts, and I was concerned about the liability of people not knowing that they were actually police officers, but that was something they did in the contract negotiations with the city. So I had no control over that. I have said at the beginning, I'm more than happy to show you our policies and how we recruit and how we deal with civilian complaints. The numbers are what they are. I'll provide those all to you, and any suggestions, anything that the city council thinks we can do to make this a better place is fine. I understand that the union, I haven't read everything online. I did see what they put out. It was handed to me after it was sent out. The union is feeling, I guess, not supported by the city is kind of what they're leaning towards. But I think, you know, after the last meeting, I spoke to the union president, and I think it was Noelle said she wanted to talk to the boots on the ground. And I said, well, I'll talk to the union president. And he said he was more than willing to meet with this board. Now, I don't know if that's the case. I mean, with this committee. So I don't know if that's the case. Now I'll speak to him and find out if he'd still be willing to speak to this committee. So I can let you know at the next meeting.
Thank you, and I didn't imagine in any way you had control over your union, so I hope it didn't sound that way.
And thank you, Noelle, for not skirting over that. Shout out to diversity and staying connected and collaborating together. So that's a great way to end it. Positive note. If we can get a motion to adjourn. Who was that? I saw one, the last hand I saw was Noelle Chaddock.
I'll second that.
All in favor? All righty. I'll see y'all next time.
Thank you all for being here.
Good night, all.